In this video, we're going to talk about protist ecology and classification. Remember that protists as a group of organisms are very diverse in what they do. So they serve a lot of different ecological roles depending on what the type of protist is. So one of their roles is as a primary producer, and these are going to be our photosynthetic organisms. So plants are also an example of a primary producer, but protists, especially our photosynthetic protists like algae, produce almost as much oxygen and organic compounds as plants do. And plants get all the credit, but really without protists, we would be in big trouble. These primary producer protists also help form the base of the aquatic food chain. And during the process of photosynthesis, they convert carbon dioxide to oxygen. So remember, they actually reduce carbon dioxide in the environment and they increase oxygen, which is the oxygen that humans and other living organisms need in order to survive. One kind of cool example of a primary producer that is a protist are the zooxanthellae. And these are a type of dinoflagellate, which we'll talk a little bit more about those later in another video. But these are photosynthetic protists that have a symbiotic relationship with corals. And the coral gives the protist protection, and then the protist provides the coral with nutrients through that photosynthesis. Now, this picture here is actually showing something called coral bleaching. And this is a problem that is likely associated with global climate change. So you can see that there are some areas where the coral has color, and this is the healthy coral here. But all of this white coral here is coral that has been bleached. And what that means is that the zooxanthellae have died and they're no longer providing the coral with nutrients. And so the coral is also dying. And this is likely due to increased temperatures in the ocean. Some protists are pathogenic. Remember that a pathogen is anything that can cause disease. Viruses and bacteria, some bacteria, are also examples of pathogens. And with protists, some of these pathogens are actually parasites. And so these are organisms that live on or another organism and they harm the host organism in the process. So two that are fairly common that you've maybe heard of before are things like malaria, which is caused by the protist Plasmodia or Plasmodium. And this protist is transferred from one person to another through mosquitoes. And if you look at this picture here, these little kind of dark spots here are the protists. And then these circles here are red blood cells. And so this protist gets into the bloodstream and it causes damage to the red blood cells, which can result in anemia or even potentially death. Another pathogenic protists are known as trypanosomes, and they can cause African sleeping sickness, which can also be very serious, where essentially the body just kind of starts to shut down. And you can see that in this picture here. These kind of darker purple things are the protists. And then these are the red blood cells. Plants can also be affected by parasitic protists, and this is a problem because it can destroy crops and or affect the quality of the plant. So some examples of plant parasites, there's this Plasmapara viticola, which we can see here, and it is classified as an oomycete. The Great Irish Potato Blight, which caused the potato famine back in Ireland many, many years ago, was also caused by a parasite, the Phytophthora infestans. So as you can see, this protist decreases the quality of the potato. And back in the 1800s, it caused a famine in Ireland because all the potato crops were, or a lot of them were affected by this protist, and they relied heavily on potatoes as a source of nutrition. Some protists fulfill the ecological role of decomposers, and we call these saprobes. And these are protists that can break down dead or dying organic material and recycle those nutrients. So if it weren't for these decomposers, when leaves fell off of a tree or when a plant died or when an animal died, if there was nothing to decompose them, then these basically dead organisms would just pile up and the earth would just be covered in dead matter. So these decomposers are really important to break down these dead organisms and recycle nutrients like carbon and oxygen and hydrogen back into the ecosystem. So now let's talk a little bit more about how protists are classified before we talk about the different kind of taxonomic divisions that are associated with protists. So first of all, protists are eukaryotes. So they are in the domain eukarya because they are made up of eukaryotic cells. And remember with classification, the kind of the broadest classification is known as the domain. And we've already talked about two other domains so far. We've got domain bacteria, domain archaea, and now we're talking about domain eukarya. From domain, we can actually become, if we look at a classification scheme, we can become more and more specific. So domain is the broadest classification, followed by kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species. And once again, the domain is the broadest classification, and then as we move down these different levels, we become more and more specific until we get to the species level. Now, protists are hard to classify. They are not monophyletic, meaning that they don't have a single common ancestor. And different protists are actually classified in these different groups that are not necessarily with other protists. So, for example, we have our algae plants here that are lumped together with land plants in their classification. Down here we have the choanoflagellates, which is a protist, that are lumped together classification-wise with fungi and animals. So protists are really interesting when it comes to classification, and the classification schemes change as we learn more about them. So generally speaking, when we're talking about the domain eukarya, we can kind of divide that up into 4 kingdoms. There's kingdom Animalia. So remember, the eukarya is the domain, and these are the kingdoms. So we've got Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and then Protista. So protists kind of form this group where if you discover something that is a eukaryote, but it's not an animal, it's not a fungus, and it's not a plant, then it's going to be classified as a protist. So protists have been classified into these 6 different supergroups. And a supergroup is kind of like a subdomain, if you will. So remember we said that domain was the broadest category, followed by kingdom. And then there's this kind of, like I said, a subdomain. So there's actually a classification in between domain and kingdom for some species called a supergroup. And you can see the names of these different supergroups on this phylogenetic tree here. So we've got the Archaeplastida, Amoebozoa, Opisthonchonta, Razaria, Chromalveolata, and Excavata. And in some other videos, we are going to look at each one of these supergroups in more detail.